The abandoned warehouse in downtown Portland erupted in flames at 2:47 a.m. on October 18, 23, with fire investigators later determining that accelerants had been used to ensure maximum destruction. Inside the burning structure, firefighters discovered a makeshift recording studio containing professional audio equipment, cameras, and what appeared to be a podcast production facility. At the center of the space, they found the charred remains of 31-year-old Isabella Ford, bound to a chair with her throat cut. The victim had been positioned facing multiple cameras that were still running when the fire started, recording her final moments in what appeared to be a planned execution. The killer had arranged the scene to look like a podcast recording session, with microphones positioned around Isabella's chair and studio lights illuminating her body. A handwritten sign propped next to her read, "Final Episode," in block letters. What made this case particularly disturbing was the discovery of audio equipment containing recordings of Isabella's voice pleading for her life, interspersed with her husband's calm narration describing his plans for her death. The recordings revealed that Isabella had been forced to participate in what her killer called the ultimate podcast episode, a real-time documentation of her own murder. The investigation would reveal that Isabella Ford had been the host of a controversial podcast called 30 Days of Sin, where she had documented her sexual encounters with 50 different men over the course of a month. The podcast had gained notoriety for its explicit content and had attracted thousands of listeners who followed Isabella's daily exploits. Her husband, 35-year-old Dr. Michael Ford, had been supportive of the project publicly, even appearing on episodes to discuss their open marriage. But behind the facade of marital consent and artistic expression, investigators would discover that Michael Ford had been planning his wife's murder for months. The podcast had been his idea, not Isabella's, and he had been using it as an elaborate form of psychological torture before executing his final plan. The warehouse fire was meant to destroy all evidence of his crimes, but crucial recordings and digital evidence would survive to expose the truth. The case would become one of the most shocking examples of domestic violence disguised as performance art, revealing how modern social media and podcasting platforms can be weaponized by abusers to humiliate and ultimately destroy their victims. Portland, Oregon, in October 2023, was a city known for its vibrant art scene, progressive politics, and thriving podcast culture. The Ford family lived in an upscale neighborhood in the Pearl District, where Isabella worked as a freelance journalist and Michael maintained a successful psychiatric practice. Their marriage had been the subject of local media attention, due to Isabella's controversial podcast and their public advocacy for non-monogamous relationships. Isabella Ford, 31, had been a respected journalist who wrote for several online publications about relationships, sexuality, and modern marriage. She had started podcasting 2 years earlier as a way to explore topics that traditional media outlets wouldn't touch. Isabella was known for her fearless approach to taboo subjects and her willingness to share intimate details of her personal life with her audience. Dr. Michael Ford, 35, was a licensed psychiatrist who specialized in relationship counseling and sexual dysfunction. He had built a successful practice treating couples and individuals dealing with intimacy issues. Michael was considered an expert in alternative relationship structures and had been featured in several academic publications about polyamory and open marriages. The couple had been married for 7 years and had no children. They lived in a converted loft that Michael had purchased before their marriage, which they had modified to include a professional recording studio where Isabella produced her podcast. The space had been designed to accommodate both Isabella's creative work and Michael's need for a quiet environment to write and conduct research. Their relationship had been publicly portrayed as a perfect example of modern marriage, with both partners supporting each other's careers and personal growth. Isabella frequently credited Michael with encouraging her to explore her sexuality and push boundaries in her work. Michael appeared regularly on Isabella's podcast, discussing their relationship dynamics and providing professional insight into the psychology of non-monogamy. The murder of Isabella Ford began at approximately 10:30 p.m. on October 17th, 2023, when Michael Ford used a sedative to incapacitate his wife at their home in the Pearl District. Security footage from their building showed Michael carrying Isabella's unconscious body to his car in a large duffel bag, loading her into his vehicle at 11:15 p.m. He had been planning this moment for weeks, having scouted the warehouse location and prepared the recording equipment in advance. Michael drove to the abandoned warehouse in southeast Portland, a building he had rented under a false name 3 months earlier. The warehouse had been converted into a makeshift podcast studio, complete with professional lighting, multiple cameras, and high-quality audio recording equipment. Michael had spent significant time and money creating what he called his final production, designing the space specifically for Isabella's murder. The killing began at approximately midnight, with Michael restraining Isabella to a chair positioned in the center of the recording setup. He had waited for the sedative to wear off before starting the cameras, wanting Isabella to be fully conscious and aware of what was happening. The audio equipment captured Isabella's confusion and terror as she realized her situation, with Michael calmly explaining that they were recording the final episode of her podcast. Over the next 2 hours, Michael subjected Isabella to psychological torture, forcing her to listen to recordings of her sexual encounters with other men while he provided clinical commentary about her behavior. He had been secretly recording her podcast sessions and personal conversations for months, compiling hours of audio that he used to humiliate her during her final hours. The recordings showed Michael's calm, professional demeanor as he systematically destroyed Isabella's psyche. The actual murder occurred at 2:30 a.m., when Michael used a knife to cut Isabella's throat while the cameras continued recording. He had positioned the blade to ensure a slow death, wanting to capture Isabella's final moments in detail. The audio equipment recorded her last words, which included pleas for forgiveness and expressions of love for Michael, despite what he was doing to her. After killing Isabella, Michael spent 15 minutes arranging the scene and ensuring that all recording equipment was functioning properly. He had planned to create a final podcast episode using the footage and audio from the murder, intending to release it as Isabella's posthumous confession and suicide note. Michael had prepared scripts and explanations that would portray Isabella's death as a result of her own guilt and shame. The fire began at 2:47 a.m., when Michael used gasoline and other accelerants to ignite the warehouse. He had calculated the timing to ensure maximum destruction of evidence while preserving certain recordings that he planned to use later. The fire spread quickly through the building, consuming most of the structure within 30 minutes. Michael had planned to use the fire to destroy any evidence linking him to the murder while creating the impression that Isabella had died in an accidental fire. Michael's attempt to cover up the crime included disabling security cameras in the area and creating false digital evidence, suggesting that Isabella had been working alone at the warehouse. He had prepared fake text messages and emails that would support his story about Isabella's supposed suicide, including fabricated communications about her guilt over the podcast project. The discovery of Isabella's body occurred at 3:15 a.m., when firefighters were able to enter the partially collapsed warehouse. The intensity of the fire had destroyed much of the evidence, but investigators immediately noticed the suspicious circumstances surrounding the scene. The professional recording equipment and the positioning of Isabella's body suggested that her death had been planned and executed rather than accidental. Initial examination of the scene revealed that Isabella had been restrained and killed before the fire started, with forensic evidence indicating that she had been alive when the flames began consuming the building. the presence of accelerants, and the methodical arrangement of the recording. Equipment suggested that the killer had extensive knowledge of both the victim and the location. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at the warehouse fire scene at 4 a.m. and immediately recognized the staged nature of the crime. The elaborate recording setup, the positioning of Isabella's body, and the use of accelerants to destroy evidence suggested a killer with intimate knowledge of the victim and careful planning capabilities. Martinez ordered a complete forensic examination of the scene and began investigating Isabella's personal and professional relationships. The investigation began with examining Isabella's podcast, 30 Days of Sin, and the extensive digital footprint she had created documenting her sexual encounters. Detective Martinez discovered that Isabella had been receiving death threats and harassment from listeners who disapproved of her lifestyle choices. However, the sophistication of the murder scene suggested that the killer had access to professional equipment and detailed knowledge of Isabella's work. Analysis of the surviving audio equipment revealed partial recordings of Isabella's final hours, including conversations with her killer that had been captured despite the fire damage. The recording showed a male voice speaking in clinical, detached tones while Isabella pleaded for her life. Voice analysis experts identified the speaker as Dr. Michael Ford, Isabella's husband, who had been presenting himself as a grieving widower to investigators. The investigation revealed that Michael had been lying about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. He had claimed to be at his office working late, but security footage from his building showed him leaving at 9 p.m., contradicting his alibi. Cell phone records placed Michael in the vicinity of the warehouse at the time of the murder. Despite his claims that he had been at home sleeping, Detective Martinez discovered that Michael had been renting the warehouse under a false identity. For 3 months before the murder, he had used a fake driver's license and credit card to lease the space, paying cash for utilities and equipment. The rental agreement showed that Michael had been planning the murder for months, gradually accumulating the materials and equipment needed for his elaborate plan. The investigation also revealed that Michael had been secretly recording Isabella's podcast sessions and personal conversations for over a year. Hidden cameras and microphones throughout their home had captured hundreds of hours of audio and video, including intimate moments between Isabella and other men. Michael had been using this material to compile evidence for what he called his final project. Financial records showed that Michael had been using Isabella's podcast earnings to fund his murder plot. He had been redirecting sponsorship money and listener donations to purchase recording equipment, rent the warehouse, and acquire the materials needed for the arson. Michael had been systematically stealing from his wife while planning her death, using her own success to finance his revenge. Digital forensics experts discovered that Michael had been creating fake social media accounts to harass Isabella and other women involved in non-monogamous relationships. He had been operating multiple online personas, sending threatening messages, and spreading false information about Isabella's personal life. The harassment campaign had been ongoing for months, with Michael presenting himself as a supportive husband while secretly tormenting his wife. The investigation revealed that Michael had been drugging Isabella with sedatives and antidepressants for weeks before the murder. Medical records showed that Isabella had been complaining of fatigue, memory problems, and mood changes, symptoms consistent with medication poisoning. Michael had been using his medical knowledge to gradually incapacitate Isabella while maintaining the appearance of a concerned husband. Detective Martinez discovered that Michael had been planning to frame Isabella's murder as a suicide caused by guilt over her podcast project. He had prepared fake diary entries and suicide notes that portrayed Isabella as overwhelmed by shame and regret. The false evidence had been designed to support Michael's narrative about Isabella's supposed mental health crisis. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Michael had been in contact with extremist groups that opposed non-monogamous relationships and sex-positive content. He had been participating in online forums dedicated to punishing women who violated traditional moral standards, sharing plans and strategies for targeting individuals like Isabella. Michael had been receiving encouragement and advice from other members of these groups. Phone records revealed that Michael had been coordinating with other individuals who had been harassing Isabella and her podcast guests. He had been providing personal information about Isabella to stalkers and had been encouraging escalating forms of harassment. The network of conspirators had been working together to terrorize Isabella and other women involved in alternative relationship structures. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Detective Martinez discovered that Isabella Ford had not been willingly participating in the 30 Days of Sin podcast. Hidden cameras throughout the Ford home revealed that Michael had been coercing Isabella into sexual encounters with other men, using threats and psychological manipulation to force her compliance. The podcast that had made Isabella famous was actually a form of systematic sexual abuse orchestrated by her husband. The shocking revelation came when forensic experts recovered deleted files from Michael's computer showing that he had been drugging Isabella and arranging sexual encounters without her knowledge or consent. The open marriage that they had publicly promoted was actually an elaborate cover for Michael's trafficking of his wife to other men. Isabella had been a victim of sex trafficking, not a willing participant in non-monogamous relationships. Further, investigation revealed that Michael had been charging men for access to Isabella, using the podcast as a marketing tool to attract potential clients. He had been operating a sophisticated prostitution ring with Isabella as the primary victim, using his psychiatric practice to identify and recruit both clients and additional victims. The podcast had been generating significant income that Michael had been keeping for himself. The investigation uncovered evidence that Michael had been planning to expand his operation beyond Isabella. He had been identifying potential victims through his psychiatric practice, targeting women who are vulnerable or isolated. Michael had been using his professional credentials to gain access to victims and had been developing a network of accomplices to help him operate multiple trafficking operations simultaneously. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that Isabella had been trying to escape from Michael for months before her death. She had been secretly recording conversations with Michael, documenting his threats and abuse while planning her own escape. Isabella had been in contact with domestic violence organizations and had been preparing to leave Michael when he discovered her plans and decided to kill her. The investigation revealed that the warehouse murder had been filmed not just for Michael's personal satisfaction, but for distribution to paying customers who had been following Isabella's case. Michael had been selling access to the murder footage to individuals who had been clients of his trafficking operation. The murder had been performed as entertainment for a network of sexual predators who had been exploiting Isabella. Detective Martinez discovered that Michael had been working with a network of other professionals who had been facilitating his trafficking operation. The network included other doctors, lawyers, and business owners who had been providing resources and protection for Michael's criminal activities. The investigation revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. The most disturbing revelation was that Michael had been planning to kill several other women after Isabella's death. He had compiled detailed files on potential victims, including their personal information, daily routines, and vulnerabilities. Michael had been preparing to expand his operation into a serial killing spree, using the profits from Isabella's trafficking to fund additional murders. The investigation also revealed that Isabella had been pregnant at the time of her death, a fact that Michael had been aware of when he planned the murder. Medical records showed that Isabella had been trying to use the pregnancy as a reason to end her involvement in the podcast, but Michael had refused to allow her to stop. The murder had been motivated partly by Michael's determination to prevent Isabella from using motherhood to escape his control. Digital evidence showed that Michael had been in contact with other individuals who had been planning similar crimes against their own wives or partners. He had been providing advice and encouragement to other men who wanted to eliminate their spouses, sharing techniques and strategies for murder and evidence destruction. Michael had been operating as a consultant for domestic violence murders. Disguised as accidents or suicides, Michael Ford was arrested on October 25, 2023, and charged with first-degree murder, sex trafficking, kidnapping, and arson. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, sought the death penalty based on the premeditated nature of the murder and the extensive evidence of torture and trafficking. The case was complicated by the discovery of Michael's criminal network, which led to additional charges of conspiracy and racketeering. The trial began on March 15, 2024, with Michael's defense attorney, Robert Martinez, arguing that his client was mentally ill and had been suffering from a psychotic break that impaired his judgment. Martinez presented expert testimony from psychiatrists who claimed that Michael had been experiencing paranoid delusions about Isabella's fidelity and had been unable to distinguish between reality and fantasy. The prosecution countered with overwhelming evidence of Michael's extensive planning and coordination with criminal accomplices. District Attorney Walsh presented the recovered audio recordings, financial records, and digital evidence showing that Michael had been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise for years. The evidence demonstrated that Michael's actions were calculated and deliberate, not the result of mental illness. The trial revealed the full scope of Michael's trafficking operation, with testimony from multiple victims who had been exploited by his network. Several women testified about being drugged and assaulted by Michael and his associates, with Isabella serving as the primary victim and unwilling star of the operation. The testimony showed that Michael had been using his psychiatric practice to identify and groom victims. Expert witnesses testified about the sophisticated nature of Michael's criminal enterprise, explaining how he had used his professional credentials and psychological knowledge to manipulate victims and evade detection. The prosecution presented evidence of Michael's connections to other traffickers and his plans to expand his operation beyond Isabella. The defense struggled to explain the extensive evidence of premeditation and coordination with criminal accomplices. While they were able to present evidence of Michael's psychological problems, they could not overcome the overwhelming proof of his criminal activities and his systematic abuse of Isabella over several years. The trial lasted 12 weeks, with testimony from over 100 witnesses. The prosecution presented evidence of Michael's trafficking network, his murder of Isabella, and his plans for future crimes. The jury heard graphic testimony about Isabella's suffering and the systematic nature of her abuse, as well as evidence of Michael's attempts to profit from her exploitation. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Michael Ford was sentenced to death for the murder of Isabella Ford, with additional life sentences for the trafficking and conspiracy charges. The judge described the case as one of the most disturbing examples of domestic violence and human trafficking in the state's history. The trial also resulted in the arrest and conviction of 12 other individuals who had been part of Michael's criminal network. The investigation led to the identification of additional victims and the disruption of several other trafficking operations that had been connected to Michael's enterprise. The case of Michael Ford and Isabella Ford exposed the dark reality of how domestic violence can be disguised as modern relationship choices and artistic expression. Michael's ability to present himself as a progressive, supportive husband while systematically trafficking and abusing his wife demonstrated how skilled manipulators can exploit social movements and cultural trends to cover their crimes. The investigation revealed that Isabella's podcast, which had been celebrated as an example of female empowerment and sexual liberation, was actually a form of systematic exploitation that had been orchestrated by her abuser. The case highlighted the importance of recognizing the signs of coercive control and the ways that abusers can use public platforms to further victimize their targets. The case also exposed the vulnerability of women in the digital age, showing how social media and podcasting platforms can be weaponized by abusers to humiliate and control their victims. Michael's use of technology to document and profit from Isabella's abuse demonstrated the need for better protections for victims of domestic violence in online spaces. The community of Portland struggled to understand how a respected psychiatrist could have been operating a trafficking network while maintaining his professional reputation. The case led to increased scrutiny of mental health professionals and new protocols for identifying and reporting suspected abuse by medical practitioners. The investigation also revealed the existence of networks of individuals who actively seek to harm women who challenge traditional relationship structures. Michael's connections to extremist groups and his coordination with other predators showed that some domestic violence cases are part of larger criminal enterprises that target women based on their lifestyle choices. The story of Isabella Ford serves as a reminder that the most dangerous abusers are often those who appear most supportive and progressive. Michael's ability to manipulate public perception while systematically destroying his wife's life demonstrates the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating relationships and supporting victims of abuse. The case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how modern technology and social media can be used to facilitate domestic violence and human trafficking, illustrating the need for continued vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals from sophisticated predators.